All right, good morning, U.S. history students. We're on section 2 of the Progressive Era unit, which is arguably one of the most important and most impactful sections of the unit, which is about women making progress during this era. Another kind of subtitle I gave it is Women's War. It's really about why and how do women get the right to vote in the United States in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So, what arguments were the most successful in achieving women's suffrage? That's the focus question. The word suffrage means the right to vote. So, how did women convince it had to be men because women couldn't vote that they should have the right to vote? So, this is from McClure's magazine. If you remember the muckrakers in the last section, this is probably the most famous muckraking magazine. And so, this is just a great image to kind of analyze. What kind of woman is this? Who is she? How old is she? I've had students say, "Oh, she's got red hair. She's probably the child of immigrants." Ooh, but she's got a pearl necklace, so she's probably upper middle class, or at least or wealthy. She's looking over her shoulder, and she's kind of the focus of the image. What kind of person is she? And the title "Women's War" is kind of indication. This is somebody who is deciding what they want to do, and so this is the author of the article right here, and women are starting to get more prominence in society in general compared to how they were early in the 19th century, largely because of industrialization and the kind of equality that happens in machine-based work between men and women, at least as far as task is concerned. Same thing starts to happen with education. You get the founding of all women's schools or high schools, or coeducational high schools like a Smith Academy, or in the case of Sophia Smith College. So you have all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but as a result of industrialization, hundreds of thousands of women with college educations who look around the world and understand it as well as the men do, and they still do not have the right to vote because of decisions made in 1776 and 1787. So that's McClure's. This is a great cartoon. I may or may not give you a document-based question about this, but basically, it's a bunch of Martian babies. Votes for our mothers. Give mother the vote. We need it, meaning the babies. Our food, our health, our play are ruled by men's votes. Isn't it a funny thing the father cannot see why mother ought to have a vote and how these things should be? Think it over. It's basically an argument that in women's traditional role as mothers, which is traditional only as much as really the 19th century is concerned, but women always were mothers. But basically, hey, how can you take care of a kid if you can't control the way the world is structured? So the very first area in which women got the right to vote were on school boards. And, that was, so there would be no other voting for women in a community except for being able to vote for, say, the school board or the sanitary commission. So areas where, it was easy to persuade people that women had a better understanding of the issue than men did. This one's hilarious. This is a cartoon, basically. Nowadays, my dear Susan, would you please keep your trousers on your side of the closet? Life, 1895. And it's a woman wearing pants, which is just, clearly terrifying to the authors back in 1895. And so the kind of pants she is wearing is it's known as a bloomer. And so you can see this woman here very immodestly dressed in her, a wrist to entirely the only part of her body that's showing is her hands and her face outfit here, very scandalous, but it was designed for riding on bicycles. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of the bicycle as far as women's liberation and women's right to vote is concerned. It's a product of industrialization, but it's also, if you think about the technology of this time period, you don't have to pay money to get on a streetcar. You don't have to ask anybody's permission, especially a man in your family, to go somewhere. And so you think to like a movie like The Wizard of Oz, you get the Wicked Witch on the bicycle. It's seen by some as a frightening thing, all women being able to go around and do whatever they want independently, and especially upper middle class women. So this is a cultural change going on. Women are getting independent, able to do what they want. So bicycles are popular amongst most men and women. This is a male bicycle club. If you've ever heard of penny farthings, these are the boys and their penny farthing club. And if you are a young man, I would recommend you try to be as cool as these guys. And they're incredibly, incredibly large bicycles. I think I actually put a link in this presentation, if you click on it, to a modern day video of people racing these ridiculous round wheeled bicycles. So this is known as the penny farthing bicycle. This is a male bicycle club. And here is the female equivalent. And I also love this picture too. This one's super funny. They're just like looking at each other. You know, these guys all have hats. She doesn't have a hat. They're looking at her. It's like, why are you wearing a beret, Nancy? But they're on what's called the safety bicycle. So this is the modern design. Like it looks very familiar. So back in the 1890s, there were more more bicycles than horses because women were able to use them and start to meet with each other and do social events without men. So part of the argument that was really persuasive for women's suffrage was the argument that women made amongst themselves, that they had independence. So this is a really cool map from 1918, 1917, right before women got the right to vote nationwide, showing the progression of it. So it's a little confusing, but basically the story of women's right to vote is in the west of the United States and the west of Canada, in this case, because it's the bigger story. Women got the right to vote before areas out east that were more settled. So that Wild West area was an area actually of more equality. You have a remote frontier society. Men and women are both pulling plows because the horse is dead. They have a pretty persuasive argument, since they're doing the same work, to say women should have the right to vote. So really, in actuality, like, hey, look, a man and a woman can handle the West as well as anybody. You do equally well. They should have the right to vote. So this is a criticism. How long will the Republic of the United States lag behind the monarchy of Canada? So the only Canadian provinces are the really remote ones in Quebec that don't have the right to vote. Same map. This is the victory map for the United States. Basically, it's showing how women's suffrage right to vote changed over time. Again, here in Massachusetts, you may be interested. Let me move my little dude. Let's see. So it looks like black, no federal suffrage, but women in Massachusetts could vote. White dots for president. So couldn't vote for senator or governor in Massachusetts back right before women's suffrage was passed, but you could vote for president for some reason. So this is kind of getting back to the meat of the question. Our Ladies Bicycle Club here. Women got college educations, upper middle class women. So they are intellectually see themselves, and frankly, we're often the superiors of men in similar positions. So you've got educated, brainy, upper middle class women on bicycles. You got lower class women. They are working in factories and dealing with the same terrible conditions as men did for half the pay, and they know this. They're also getting there on bikes. And then rural women are dealing with all of the above, but they're also isolated in the middle of nowhere. And, say you have a husband, the husband dies, you need to take care of things on your own, hence the argument for suffrage. So really, like, to answer the focus question, you've kind of got three basic arguments right here. It's often a good idea to use three pieces of evidence: education, adverse conditions, same as men, and then isolation and independence in the West. So in addition to arguing for the right to vote, which is the key right, which we'll talk about again later in the lecture, women also try to reform the working conditions. So think about those factory workers. Initially, the goal is basically to limit the workday to 10 hours. They succeeded, but only for women. So children could work more than 10 hours, which is ironic considering this is due to women's role as mothers. There's a sexism inherent to many of these kind of issues. Florence Kelly, this is a vocab term, it will be on the quiz. National Consumer League basically tried to convince people to only buy products at non-sweatshop factories. So if you ever look at like a thing of coffee, it says fair trade on it. It's a very similar idea. This is basically saying, hey, look, this isn't a terrible murder mill where, the workers are getting woven into the blankets or something. It was meant to be a consumer, and they would send inspectors in who are all women, a consumer kind of advocacy kind of organization. This is a really important one. I'm actually going to move myself so you can see the cartoon. So there are kind of two different angles on the healthcare front. There's the upper and middle class women one, which is about alcohol. So temperance is the movement that says that alcohol should be banned because it causes issues in society. They're not wrong, but this is what eventually gets the prohibition movement in the 1920s to be successful, where alcohol gets banned entirely. So drunk men coming home from factories abuse men and women. It's still true that most violent crimes are a result of alcohol consumption. This has a Christian tinge to it, and again, an upper middle class tinge. Women's Christian Temperance Union was the main kind of effort. If you go ever onto, I think it's High Street in Holyoke. Yeah, it's High Street by the library. There's a church, and in front of it, there's a big granite fountain, and it's from the Women's Christian Temperance Union to the city of Holyoke, and it says to soothe the thirsty world. And basically, the argument is, oh well, people if they just had clean water, they wouldn't drink booze. Kind of misunderstanding the problem. I think in some ways more interestingly, but also, continues to be controversial. The idea of birth control as part of women's liberation and women's rights comes out at this time period as well. So this is a magazine published by Nurse Margaret Sanger called Birth Control Review, and the cartoon's pretty clear. There's a woman chained by unwanted babies. And so what's birth control meant to be the solution for? Well, it's this. And so at the time period, there was no such thing as the pill, which is a hormonal birth control. So they would distribute things like condoms or diaphragms, and eventually this organization became Planned Parenthood. They also helped develop kind of the abortion kind of structure in the United States, and all of this was illegal from the birth control period was illegal in many states until the 1950s. So she went to jail several times, but the courts constantly validated her because any sort of law that is unequally treating men and women, that's not equal protection under the law, which is promised by the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So women basically getting treated differently than men in this way, not being able to control their own bodies, was seen by the courts back in the 1920s as a violation of their rights. This is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In the name of God and Humanity Temperance League. They're smashing the whiskey and gin barrels. You've probably seen this one already. But, again. Oh, and the reason they have an axe, there was actually genuinely a woman, I can't remember her name, Margaret something, who would go around to saloons and was so mad about the men and them drinking alcohol, she'd take an axe to the liquor bottles and just smash them up. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. It's kind of funny. There's also a racist piece here, and the Hun Rule Association, because of course there's a racist piece. It's U.S. history. The temperance movement believed that immigrants drank more booze than native-born folks, and so to try to assimilate immigrants into American culture, you could ban alcohol. So Hun Rule Association, these are meant to look like Germans. There's a lot of history to it, but basically there's a nickname for Germans who call them Huns, who were kind of conquerors from East Asia. Germans aren't conquerors from East Asia, but it doesn't matter. These are kind of the arguments, that some of which are pretty accurate. We Waste Grain is my favorite for why alcohol should be banned. This is Susan B. Anthony from the internet, and it's her with like an orb labeled equality with lightning going through it, which I think is just excellent. And that's the only reason this picture is here. She was a real person, however. And she is what's known, again, as a suffragist or a suffragette, depending on who's talking about it. So why is suffrage the key right? Well, all this other stuff, healthcare, transportation, alcohol banning, all that sort of thing. None of that can happen without the right to vote. The right to vote is the right to control our collective future. It's you basically deciding to say what you want the world to look like. And women basically understood and were able to argue, and again, this gets back to the focus question, that the outside world impacts the interior world of the home in a fundamental way. Nobody is an island, including people that claim that women just have to deal with, oh, why don't you stay in the kitchen, that kind of nonsense. So there are two waves of suffragists, one before the Civil War and one after the Civil War. The one before the Civil War fails because instead energy is poured into giving African Americans their freedom from slavery. The one after the Civil War does succeed after a period of time. The second wave includes people like this young woman here, Alice Paul, who there is pretty much not a single picture of her looking anything but kind of peeved. She is a Spitfire, and again, when I say this in class, the kids laugh because she does not look like a Spitfire. But she is part of a group called the National Women's Party. And there's also Carrie Chapman Catt, and she's kind of the legal organized version. So you've got kind of a school superintendent, Cherry Chapman Catt, and then you've got Alice Paul, who's like 19 and really, really radical. Catt writes letters, she organizes protest marches, all kind of normal civilized stuff. Paul deliberately gets herself thrown in prison. She locks herself to the White House gate. They go on hunger strikes. They fight police in fistfights. They usually win. And they're just kind of, again, they're hellions. Alice Paul is eventually thrown in prison. They force feed her because she's going on a hunger strike by putting a rubber tube down her throat, and it's torture. It's illegal under the Geneva Conventions nowadays. So Paul is a political prisoner who's being tortured in prison, helping, and this is during World War One, by the way, that they're doing this. And so by the end of the First World War, basically everyone in the federal government has made a promise to give women the right to vote because they're embarrassed, frankly, by women protesting for their rights in the middle of a world war. And on June of 1919, three-quarters of the states passed the 19th Amendment, and on August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. So that's another picture of Alice Paul. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College, which is right near us in South Hadley, and that's kind of where she got radicalized and became a fighter for human equality. This is Seneca Falls. So this is kind of the star of the story that you would have learned about in US 1, kind of the first women's rights convention in human history. And we were voters out west. Why deny our rights in the east? Great question, ladies. Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? Congressional Union, Pennsylvania. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? So this is in front of the White House, and this is an innovation. This really had not happened before. The suffrage prisoners arrested for political offense. We demand they be treated like political offenders. To ask freedom for women is not a crime. Suffrage prisoners shall not be treated as criminals. So again, throwing women into prison because they're protesting like this peacefully for the right to vote. This is the one that got President Wilson really upset. In World War One, and we're going to learn about this soon, but the United States was fighting the Germans. The German emperor's title is Kaiser. So they call the president of the United States, hey, look, you're an emperor, a dictator. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed, meaning they don't have the right to vote? 20 million American women are not self-governed. The U.S. pop was 40 million. Take the beam out of your own eye. Hey, can't you see? Like, imagine you got a stick sticking out of your eye, and you're saying that you can't see it. It's like, oh, look at them. They got a stick in their eye, and you got one sticking right out of your face. It's grotesque, but it's basically don't be a hypocrite, US. You claim to be for freedom, give it to us. This is a sweet old lady being hassled by police, again, in front of the White House because she's part of Alice Paul's radical suffrage organization. Again, this is an argument. Like, you look at this picture, is the picture telling you that the police are the good guys or this old lady is the good guy? And so this is, change comes differently to different places in the country. This is Missouri. And I just love these headlines. This is 1920. Milk takes another hike in Columbia, so milk's more expensive. Columbia County, Missouri. Deficient moisture decreases crops. Russia surrenders in World War I. Well, sort of. This is the communist Russians don't conquer Poland. And women's right to vote now part of the Constitution. Leaders cheer when told news. Are disappointed when informed there will not be a public ceremony, no leaders selected. So, progress, but slowly. And that's that. Okay.